I've been having a good time reading your book
Oh,
and
good.
have actually, incorporated a lot of things into my life because of it. And it has a lot of overlap with the type of therapy that I do, which is ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy, which has a lot to do with crafting your life based on your values and what would be more meaningful. So it's
Awesome.
great.
Well, I hope to be able to hear which pieces of it you've been applying and that really resonate.
Yes, yes, a couple of exercises in particular, and actually even my decision to just this last week, I booked a trip to Mexico with my husband
Yay.
for 1 week later. It was an impulsive
Fantastic.
booking, and it was in part because of these concepts of thinking about how at least I often will have a tendency to put off certain things that are really important to me until I get something else done first, and my husband is in that category of the put off, until some future event thing. So,
Well,
yeah.
often that is the case because your husband is around and you have this sort of idea of like, oh, we always have each other. There will always be more time, and everything else seems pressing. But it's so wonderful that you are prioritizing him and each other. Fantastic.
Yes.
I'm really excited for you guys.
Yeah, it goes hand in hand with, I'm gonna go with him, and I'm also gonna write. I'm working on a second book, so also that's the other thing that I tend to put off is writing the
Yeah.
book that I wanna write. So, putting those together and putting them up front, to use my time in ways that are more aligned with my values and the life that I wanna build. And that's what your book is all about. It's called The Happier Hour, and I'm hoping today we can talk about some of the ideas you have in there, uh, just on a personal level, and also give folks strategies about their own use of time and maybe changing some perspectives on time as well, which is what your book does. And then some of the exercises that you do. And I can share a little bit about some of those exercises that I've done. To get us oriented, you take this concept of time where it's like being time rich or being time poor, both are problematic. It's not that we necessarily need more time, but it's how we're using our time that matters. So, can you talk a little bit about just sort of the premise of this work and your research into?
And it all sort of started from a very personal experience, which I shared as a story to open the book. Um, when, as you mentioned, there's sort of time poor and then time rich. I was definitely in a time poor state. So
Mm.
it was earlier in my career when I was still on the faculty at Wharton living in Philly. And it was one of those crazy days that so many people can relate to because we all have these crazy days that we're running around. And in this particular case, I'd gone up to New York that day to give a talk about my research, and my presentation was sandwiched within these back to back meetings. And then I was rushing to this networking sort of colleague dinner and then rushing like a crazy person. I was so stressed to get to the train station to catch the very last train that would get me home to my 4 month old and my husband who were asleep in Philly. And I remember so vividly sitting on the train that night, looking out the window as sort of the darkness was whizzing by. And I was like, I don't know if I can keep up, right? Between the pressures of work, wanting to be a good partner, wanting to be a good friend, wanting to be a good parent, the never ending pile of chores. It's like there simply weren't enough hours in the day to get it all done, let alone to do any of it well, let alone to enjoy any of it. And I was in that state. I was like, all right, the solution is clear. I need to quit. I need to
Mhm.
quit my job and move to a sunny, slow paced island somewhere. And, so many of us in those crazy days, I think, do have that daydream of like, I can't do it all. So I'm going to quit. And then when I have a whole lot more time, then surely I would be happier. Um, but I did not actually quit. I was like, I wonder if it's actually true. Are people who have a whole lot more time to do exactly what they want over the course of their days, are they happier? And this is an empirical question, and I'm a social psychologist. And these are the types of questions that we can put to data. And we did. And we looked at what's the relationship between the amount of discretionary time people have and their happiness. And we looked at data across tens of thousands of working as well as non working Americans. And the pattern was consistent across all of our studies. Namely, it was a sort of upside down U shape or like a rainbow. So, what that suggests is that it's down on both ends of the spectrum. So, yes, with too little time, people are less happy. So, that was me on the train. That was all of us in those days rushing around. And the reason that we're less happy is because we have higher levels of stress. But I think the really surprising and important piece of it was that other side, that other side showed that there is such thing as having too much time. Actually, when people had in that data set of the American Time Use Survey, it showed that people with more than approximately 5 hours of discretionary time in the day, they were less happy. And then we dug into that. Well, sort of like why? Why is it that if you had all the hours of your days to spend exactly how you wanted, people are less happy? And what it turns out is that we are driven to be productive, right? And we are averse to being idle. And so when we have all the hours of our days with nothing to show for how we spent those hours, it undermines our sense of purpose. And yes, there are activities that you can spend your time on that don't involve paid work that can provide a sense of purpose, volunteering or, engaging in an enriching hobby. But I realized that for me, I get a great sense of purpose from the work that I do. And so that is to tell us, okay, don't quit. Don't quit these things that, yes, there's features of our jobs and there's features of everything that aren't just absolutely happy. But the solution isn't to do less. And what is actually really interesting is also that you saw in the data set that there was this, like, it went down on both sides, but in the middle it was largely flat, which suggests that there's no relationship between the amount of discretionary, except at the extremes. There's no relationship between the amount of discretionary time people have and their happiness, which suggests that it's not about how much you have for the most part. It's really how you invest what you have. That is, it's not about how much time you have available. It's not about being time rich in terms of having a whole lot of time. It's really about how do we spend our time to make that time rich? How do we invest the hours of our days so that we look back on the days, and even if busy, that we feel fulfilled and satisfied, as opposed to that overwhelmed, depleted, stressed out, burnt out. And so I didn't quit. As I mentioned, I actually went to study this, and I actually shifted my whole research paradigm to try to figure out, like, okay, how should we be investing the hours of our days to make our time feel richer, to make us feel happier in the days and more satisfied about our lives? And from that, I developed a course that I've been teaching to our MBAs at UCLA for the last 4 years. And it's been so fantastic to see the effect of applying these empirically based insights to their lives and seeing just how much more connected, how much more engaged, how much happier, how much more satisfied they are in their lives, as well as um, being more thoughtful and intentional about sort of designing their life and career track to be more in line with their values. And as not only have I been teaching it to my students, but I absolutely live all of this stuff. I
Yeah.
apply the insights and benefit, and I'm happier as a result.
Yeah. Well, college is such a good example, graduate school as well, where I'll have college students that are my clients, and I get to, see them right before finals week where they're miserable because they have no time to do anything but study, and they're just completely consumed by their work. And then they're also miserable like 2 months into summer when they're stuck at home and they have no sense of purpose. And how many times can you go to the beach or how many movies can you watch, right? And so
Absolutely.
there is those extremes of the times when we are too crunched, and I certainly see that in my life. If there's no breathing space at all, there's no margin, there's no room
Mhm.
between one thing to the next, I'm in hurry mode and
Yeah.
I'm not actually in my life. I'm just getting to the next thing, which is not satisfying. And then also the other aspect of when there's so much unstructured time that we don't savor it as much because it's an unlimited resource, and maybe we don't see this aspect of impermanence and how impermanence really does help shape our actions into being able to live like this might be the last time you ever get to live this way. And one of the things that one of the exercises that you had us do in the book was start to look at sort of the number of times that you have left doing something. And I
Yeah.
think this it's an impermanence exercise, which is very much overlap with ACT of looking at sort of when we look at impermanence, it highlights our values very well. I did this exercise with my sons who I read to bed at night, and I read
Oh,
about you
lovely.
reading
Yeah.
your partner reads to your
Yeah.
children, and that's an important activity that he engages in. But when you start to hit 13, uh, reading to bed at night becomes a very limited activity, right? There's going to
Yeah.
be there's a window is getting smaller and smaller of when I'll be, cozying up in bed reading. And now we're reading books like The Da Vinci Code, where I have to censor half of it because I'm embarrassed reading about some of the
Right.
content. But this is a limited activity that now I only have sort of a handful of times when I'm going to read to him. And it really shapes my way in which knowing that in which I engage with that. Because I think as any parent, we've read books where we're just in our head the whole time and actually not even paying attention to reading. And then we've also read books where we're just noticing how sweet it is to be in this moment with somebody. But can you tell us how you do that exercise? Because you had a fun way of mapping it out on a piece of paper and sort of doing
Yeah.
some math around it to help people look at time and use of time.
Yeah, and it is a really impactful and important exercise, because even in our busiest of days and weeks, there are these little moments of potential joy. But when we are so busy, we don't even notice because we're rushing through them. Or, as you mentioned, when we have all the time in the world, we also don't notice because we expect that they will continue to be available to us. So we do sort of take them for granted. Yet it's these sort of moments of joy. And in my research, we actually found that ordinary experiences like reading to your kids at bedtime, like going for a walk with your partner, going for a walk with your dog, we find these ordinary experiences can actually um, create as much happiness as extraordinary ones, like those extraordinary experiences like going on an incredible vacation, or going to a concert. And what we found is that it was when people recognized that their time is limited that they savored these simple pleasures more and they paid more attention to them. And from that, they folks enjoy, as you know, like wonderful amounts of happiness from these really accessible everyday experiences. Now, how do we make it so that we don't take them for granted? So that we make the time, even in those hectic days. And when we're spending the time, that we pay attention so that we enjoy the happiness from it. And it's counting how many times do you have left to do this experience, and looking at the percentage. And so, an example is my coffee date with my daughter, Lita. And so, this is something that we do each week. And it was actually born out of a really functional routine, as in, on my way to drop her at preschool next to my office, I wanted coffee, and so we would stop at the coffee shop. But we turned that routine into a ritual. And it became this like really special and meaningful 30 minutes, not a lot of time, just 30 minutes. And she would get her hot chocolate. I got my flat white. We would get croissants, and it was just 30 minutes of just the two of us chatting and being together. Now, it happens every week. So I could, like if I didn't recognize just how sort of precious this time was, it would be very easy for me on a week when I need to get to a meeting, or something else takes its place, that it's like, okay, we don't have time for this. But the first step in the exercise is to count how, once you've identified a sort of joyful activity or something that you love to do, is count how many times have you done this in your life so far. So I calculated, if I include my daily coffee trips to the coffee shop during my maternity leave and then our weekly ones since, I calculated that my daughter and I have gone on about 400 coffee dates in our life thus far. Then the next step is to calculate how many times do you likely have left to do it. And this is the important part, to account for the fact that circumstances in your life are likely to change. And if your joyful activity involves someone else, circumstances in their life are likely to change. So you mentioned your kids now in their teen years, you know, reading together at night, it becomes more intermittent, if at all. And then, like, at some point, they're going to go off to college, and then they're going to, live across the country, And so I calculated. So my daughter is 7. I was like, okay, when she's 12, she's probably going to want to go to the coffee shop with her friends more than with me. And then she's going to go off to college, and then she's going to live in New York if she's like anything like me. And so I calculate we have about 230 coffee dates left. And then the
Mhm.
last step in the exercise is, okay, out of your total dates in your life or times of doing this activity, what percentage do you have left? And so I realized that we have 36% of our coffee dates. That's much less than half, and she's only 7. And so recognizing that is so important, because what it does is it makes me make the time, right? As I mentioned, like, if even if it's a busy week and it might seem easier in the moment not to stop at the coffee shop and have those 30 minutes, it makes me make the time. It also, when I'm during the date, it makes me pay attention because I recognize just how precious this time is. And from the sort of limited, knowing that it's finite, knowing that it's not going to last forever in that particular way, is really, really important. And I think this exercise does a good job of not only sort of reminding us to make the time and to be engaged during that time, but it also highlights just how important time is as a resource. Like, how important our time is. Like, these minutes, the 30 minutes, are just part of the week, and these weeks add up to our months and years and life. And this is like, these little bits are all part of the bigger picture, and we can't pass them by. So yeah, I'm glad you asked about that exercise, because it's one of my favorite. And I will say that, like, when I have my students do this in class, I've had a couple, be like, "What are you doing to us?" Because I've, like, inevitably people tear up when they realize that their dinners with their parents are much more limited than they ever imagined. Or one of my students, he calculated watching sports on the couch with his best friend, middle school, high school years. It was an embarrassing number of hours that they spent watching sports. But then, now that they have their own families and live in different places, like, that simple pleasure of sitting with your best friend and watching, hanging out, was really limited. And actually, sort of similar to you said, like, afterwards, you're like, you booked a trip with your husband. My student in the next class break, he went out and he called his buddy and he's like, "I'm coming to visit you. Just me, you. It's a guy's weekend." So it does motivate prioritizing these moments of joy.
Yeah, so you do 2 things, right? So one is choosing to spend your time differently than your automatic tendency would be to, "Oh, that I can do that another time. It'll always be available, so I can fit in this, like, sneaky work or, sneaky meeting. It's just this one time," when it's not just this one time, right? Every time matters more when you start to count, the limited resource. But then you also spend your time differently when you're in it. And, I think about for folks that have that are adults with aging parents, when you start, and I've done this with clients, when you start to look at something like the holidays, how many, say you alternate with your in-laws, how many holidays do you have left with this parent, right? And how
Yeah.
are you going to show up at those holidays? Are you going to show up as, you know, in a place of conflict and non-acceptance and trying to change them? But like, if you only have 10 left or 5 left, like only 5 more of these, how would you show up differently? That the concept of people tearing up is very much related to when you make contact with things that are meaningful to you, they touch you, and it's you're moved, and it's actually being moved that motivates us to make different choices. So I think that's a good thing that your students are tearing up, that you can say,
Yeah,
good, that
they're
means you
tearing
made
up
you
and
made
they're like, "We
contact.
thought this was a happiness
Yeah.
class and you're making us cry." I'm like, "But it's so important and you will thank me." And they
Well,
inevitably
yeah.
do.
And it depends on how you define happiness, because I had Aaron Westgate on a while back, and we talked about definitions of happiness, that it is, sure, there's the pleasurable joy aspects of happiness, but there's also meaning and also psychological richness and growth. So there's another task that I have been thinking about, which is some of our daily activities that a lot of times people rate as low on the happiness scale. So things like commuting and housework, which actually I love housework. I'm like one of those oddballs. I love to cook and I love to clean. It's like super satisfying for me. But commuting, and I calculated how long it takes for me to, like, this afternoon, go drive from my house to go pick up one child that's 20 minutes away, and then wait in the car line that's very slow to go around the loop. It's like In-N-Out Burger car line for them to get in,
Yeah,
to
yeah.
then drive to pick up the other child, to then wait for their car line of the In-N-Out Burger, to them get in the car, to then take them to the after school activity. And it's a good hour and 25 minutes, hour and a half of car time.
Yeah.
And I started looking at that based on some of your recommendations of the book, because it was something that I wasn't liking so
Mhm.
much, and looking at how I could insert more of my values into my car time. So I did everything from, I changed it now so that I get to the loop and I park a block away, and I calculated it takes me just as much time to walk from my car to go get my kid at the loop and then walk him back as it does to wait in. And it's more enjoyable because now in my hour and 25 minutes, I'm walking in the middle of it, and I'm actually
Yeah.
greeting him as opposed to him just jumping in the back of the car. And then I also incorporated in some silent time. So on my drive out, I keep silent. I don't turn on any podcast, any music. I don't call anyone. And I use that time just to be quiet with myself, which is for me something that I don't have a lot of or don't have enough of in my
Yeah.
life, is just quiet reflection time to just breathe and experience silence. And then the last thing that I did was made it connecting time with my kids. So uh, that when we're driving, I get a little bit of one-on-one time with my little one, which is kind of sweet to see. Just have that. He's usually eating like half of his lunch because he didn't eat it during the day, and we're
Yeah.
sort of chatting about what lunchtime and
Yeah.
little things. But reclaiming these hours that we don't like and
Mhm.
shifting them to be different. Tell us a little bit about that research and what you suggest for folks around the time that we don't like, how to shift
Yeah,
it.
and there inevitably is gonna be time that we don't like, and you can identify, so there's sort of 2 steps of this, of identifying, and maybe you don't even need to track your time to identify the times you don't like, but I do, suggest that people spend a week tracking their time. Over the course of a week, writing down for each 30-minute interval what you're doing, and as importantly, rating on a 10-point scale, how do you feel? How did that activity make you feel coming out of it? How joyful, satisfied, fulfilled, on a 10-point scale? And what's really helpful, while I will admit sort of a tedious task to track, it's really worth it because at the end of the week, you have this fantastic personalized data set. So you can look across your activities and see, okay, what are those activities that get my highest ratings, that make me feel really fulfilled and satisfied? What are those that are my least happy? And those, I'll get to, because that is the sort of the point of your question. But then you also actually pick out, you can see not only the how you're feeling in your activities from your activities, but also just how much time you're spending.
Mm.
Um, and so, like, you might see, like, oh my gosh, I'm spending a surprising amount of time for you, you know, to commuting, or some it's scrolling social media. And it's this surprising thing because you think that, like, oh, it's just going to be a couple minutes. And those couple minutes turn into a half hour. And those half hours add up to, tens of hours in your week. And what's also surprising is that oftentimes those are getting very middling ratings. And so people have this notion of, like, oh, that's my, my pleasure, like I enjoy scrolling, or, at the end of the night or at the end of the day, turning on the TV and sort of watching TV for, for hours each night. And it's like this surprising thing because people are like, oh, that's my way I treat myself. But actually, I'm not all that happy from doing it. So that's a helpful thing to recognize because it identifies hours that you can reallocate to activities that do actually make you feel more satisfied. Now, for those least happy activities, and the time tracking research points to, on average, commuting, hours spent at work, as well as housework, are the activities that typically are associated with the lowest levels of happiness. And the commuting in particular, the reason that people experience it as so painful is it because it feels like a waste of time. As you said, it's an hour and a half that you're almost like waiting to get through. It's just something that you have to do, but the content itself isn't all that satisfying. And so, one of the strategies to make that wasteful time feel more worthwhile is bundling. And it's such a simple idea, but it's really effective. And it came out of research by Katie Milkman and her colleagues, which is just bundle that thing you don't like to do with an activity you do like to do. So you noted commuting you don't like to do, but having time outside, which actually research shows is a significant mood booster, is very, like, it is really positive. That social connection with your little one. Again, it's not just sort of like you guys both waiting through the car ride to pick up the next. It's You've turned it into time that is really intentional and thoughtful, as time just the two of you to catch up on the day and spend together. For some, it is an audiobook. So oftentimes we get in the car and we sort of scroll through radio stations without thinking. So it's very sort of just filling the space. But one of the things that people say when I'm doing the research on time poverty, I ask them to complete the sentence: I don't have time to blink. And that is actually in itself, I encourage folks to do, because that points out these opportunities of spending in these ways that are really important to you. But oftentimes people are like, I don't have time to read for pleasure. Now, if every time you got in the car, you turned on an audiobook, then every week or so you would read, like you would get through an entire book. And so it takes that time, or listening to a podcast, right? It's time that is enriching and educating and illuminating and inspiring, as opposed to just wading through it. So, bundling, I'm very impressed that you enjoy housework, probably because it feels satisfying and you can see the immediate benefit of your work. But for other, oftentimes people don't. I don't enjoy folding laundry, but now, I will turn on a stream a show that nobody else in my family wants to watch. And so all of a sudden, folding laundry is this like time that I sort of look forward to because I get to watch, a show. So you can bundle these unfun activities with more fun activities to make that time more fun.
Yes, I love that. That's one of the strategies we did in our house around laundry folding, which is it laundry folding happens on Sundays with a sports game where we take the big bucket of laundry
Yeah.
and we pour it in the middle of the playroom and say, "Have fun." An hour and a half later, I want this folded and put away. Enjoy the game. And then all
Right.
of a sudden, it's like it gives you something to do while you're watching a sports game, and So yes, there is something to be said about we kind of like there's this fine line between like making every minute meaningful and productive, which could make us anxious, right?
Yeah,
Versus
there's pressure.
being in this being in this minute and in this moment and not always thinking I'm trying to get to somewhere other than where I am. Because going back to folding laundry, I remember folding those little tiny onesies and those little tiny socks and those little tiny shirts. And I would give
Mhm.
anything to fold that little onesie again. They were so cute and tiny. Now I can't tell what's my husband's clothes and what's my son's clothes. They're the same size t-shirts. So there is something precious in every moment if if we shift the way that we see it
Yeah.
and shift the way that maybe we place our intention around it.
I would like to add to that because often I'm sort of in this realm of time management. Um, a lot of the advice is to how to be more efficient. It's how to get more things done more quickly. And I think that actually is what needs to be shift. It's not about efficiency, it's about what's worthwhile. So
Yeah.
it's about how do you spend your time to make it all feel worthwhile. And that can come from, as you said, you have that quiet car time where it's just silent because that is worthwhile time. That's time for reflection. Um, and making, doing the bundling of folding the laundry while watching TV. It's not about getting it done quicker. It's about making the time that you are going to be spending folding the laundry and maybe you don't want to spend, but when you have the TV on and the kids sort of like playing around you, then that all of a sudden that time feels more worthwhile. So
Yeah.
I do think it is an absolute shift in mindset, even the goal of this whole time
Yeah.
spending endeavor, that it is about what's worthwhile and not efficiency, because the efficiency mindset is what I think trips so many of us up of like, and the pressure of like
Yeah.
doing every moment to like make it the like be able to check off like
Yeah,
better
being a
and
maximizer.
more.
Yeah. Well,
um
and to clarify, it's my children that are folding the laundry in front of the sports game, not me, which is part of the practice of having them shift their relationship around we don't use the word chores in our house. We talk about things as these are the things that a household needs to get done for a household to function. Just like if you were in a workspace, we all have to contribute to the workspace, or when you have roommates someday, it's like how is this household going to function? So
yeah.
if you want to make it more enjoyable while you watch a sports game, go for it and help them shift
Right.
shift their perspective around it. But that's an important component because oftentimes the things that make our life the most meaningful are actually not the things that are the most productive. And I did another exercise of yours, which is interviewing an elder. And I chose my neighbor who is a dear friend of us, our family, and someone that I deeply respect. She's like who I want to be when I grow up and has been who I want to be when I grow up. And went over there and asked her a few questions. I just brought my morning coffee over and said, "Hey, can I ask you a few questions? I'm doing a little exercise for this book, Happier Hour." And she listens to the podcast. She's a big fan. But I asked her these three questions that you recommended. I asked her, looking back on your life, what are your greatest sources of pride? Looking back on your life, what are your greatest sources of regret? And then I asked her about some important decisions. What's turned out to matter more than you expected? And what she shared was interesting. So she was actually pretty quick to answer these questions. She's pretty self reflective. And her answers to the greatest sources of pride and greatest sources of regret all had to do with connections, and they all had to do with being present with her children and now her grandchildren, and some regret over not being present. And then the important decisions, sort of what turned out more than she expected, was the value of being patient. She said, we don't always need to act and fix things. And we can trust that we are evolving, and sometimes things fix themselves if we are patient enough. So it was great because it was such an example of, wait, this isn't efficiency with time. This is
Yeah.
actually the opposite of that. It's like being present and being patient. But this was her wisdom from, someone that's now a grandparent and an elder.
It's so fantastic, and I'm so glad that you did that exercise because I think it's a really powerful one. And the reason that I encourage folks to do it and I have my students do it is because here we are, sort of so often just thinking hour by hour of like wanting to make choices that will make, life overall, quote unquote, successful or satisfying. And then the question is like, well, what is even a good life? And there are people who have lived one that we can learn from. And so I encourage folks to we have wisdom that can be gained from those who are looking back on, like, those who from our perspective have lived a good life, that are happy, who are satisfied, or quote unquote successful in, oftentimes it's like happy and satisfied. Um and asking, what are those greatest sources of pride? What are those greatest sources of regret? So that it can help inform us as we're making decisions today. And I've been having my students over the years do this every time I teach the course, and the consistency is remarkable about what these remarkable people are proud of and what these remarkable people regret. And connection, social connection, and those relationships are so far and away what people point to as their source of pride. And these are, in many cases, very professionally successful and accomplished individuals, but it's their relationships with their family that they're so proud of. And also the regret, as like your neighbor, it's the regret from not investing enough in those relationships. Some people actually say they don't have regrets, which is really wonderful. And it's not baloney, because um, maybe your neighbor with her patients, um, these the if we sort of live well and sort of fix the things that we mess up along the way to the extent possible, or wait them out patiently, um, then actually we can reach a state without feeling regret. And that's actually really the goal of things. It's not that we're not going to mess up. Of course, we're all going to mess up at points, but it's how we deal with those mess ups, and also not missing out on investing in ways that matter, so that we look back and feel like we've messed up on that really big thing of not having really lived and been present and missing out on so many moments.
What I liked about this exercise is you get to borrow your, elders' regrets because and to help you maybe make different decisions. I
Absolutely.
had a conversation with Daniel Pink about his book, The Power of Regret, and it was great because he has studied thousands of people's regrets and what are the common themes around people's regrets, right? And that can inform us so that we make different decisions in our lives. I think it's actually one of the gifts of being a, psychologist is that I hear many different stories and it helps me shape my life of like, okay, I could see where this could take me if I were to continue on this path. Even something as simple as my mom for Thanksgiving compiled this whole like video montage of all Thanksgivings past. And it was really sweet. I mean, she just had the best time collecting all these pictures. And then she sent it to me and I was too busy to look at it. And I was just like, "I don't have time to look at your Thanksgiving montage, mom. I have so many like, I'm just trying to make it to Thanksgiving, okay? And now I have this trip to Mexico to plan." Just putting a wrench in everything, which is good. It's good I'm doing it. But then I had a client come in sharing about what it was like to for their daughter not to look at her pictures that she shared and being able to have that reflection of, "Okay, wait, this actually really matters. This is a moment of connection of someone sharing something with you that's important to them and it's important for you to look at it and to take the time for it because how many more times do I have my mom sharing Thanksgiving montages with me? It sort of could be limited.
And
So I may
yeah.
regret it at some point if I don't take the time to look. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, that actually, even doing this exercise, often folks do it with parents. It's also an avoid. Not only are we learning from their regrets to avoid them, but then we also don't regret not having asked these really illuminating questions and connecting questions of these elders whom aren't going to be around forever. And I've had actually, within the last month, one of my former students emailed me and was just saying that they are so glad that they did that exercise. And she said with her grandma, because her grandmother has passed away, and that she's so grateful to have had that conversation, which was so connecting um, before it was too late. So that's also, not only do we learn their, learn their regrets to avoid them, but it's also, we we won't regret not having those really connecting conversations.
Yeah, I know. I think about that with my neighbor because, she's not going to always be my neighbor. And neighbors and everyone where you think, oh, they're going to be there forever. They're just your neighbor. Go and borrow some butter but that's not the case. And being able to do that really, it was a little bit awkward to step into someone's house and ask them these deep questions, but it was that awkwardness built something sort of a more meaningful connection with
And I'm
her.
sure she
And
was so flattered. It's so interesting, and a lot of these, and there's research to support it, that we think things are going to be more awkward than they are, and they actually turn out to be really beneficial, both for the initiator and the responder. So complimenting. So there's work by Nick Epley and his colleagues, which we think that it will be awkward to compliment someone, like just anyone about anything, walking by and, complimenting someone's shoes or whatever it is. We think it's going to be awkward. And also, we think that they know it already. But their research shows that people are more surprised, the recipient of the compliment, and they are significantly happier having received that compliment than anyone predicts. And so it suggests that we should sort of get over this fear of awkwardness, of like complimenting or going to someone and being like, I really admire you and I want to learn from your life and I have a couple of questions.
yeah.
So yeah.
Another awkwardness is reaching out to relationships that have maybe just sort of lost their thread for whatever reason. Maybe there was a little bit of conflict at some point, or something got awkward between you, or you just didn't tend to it because you got busy in your life. And I find that clients have a really hard time, and people, including myself, have a hard time reconnecting with people. And that is time well spent because it even though it feels awkward, I actually have never I think most people just feel grateful that someone has remade that connection. So that's another good use of, your time.
Yeah.
So what other things have come up in this research, either personally for you, things that you've changed in your own life as a result of doing this? I mean, obviously you moved to UCLA, more sun.
Yes.
But, things that you're doing differently in your life because of this research.
As I mentioned, I do live it. And I think that the little things along the way, like the coffee date example with my daughter, I continue to sort of touch to because it shows up as beneficial in a lot of different ways. Because what it highlights is that it's not about how much time, it's not only, I already said, it's not about how much time you have available, it's how you spend that time. But it's also not even how much time you spend on these things that matter. It's how you engage in that time. And as a parent of young kids who is working in a profession that I also really love, and I have a partner whom I also really love, and friendships whom, I also really love, that it's there's the potential for sort of guilt of like, oh, I can't spend all the time that I would like to on all of these different sort of relationships and parts of my interests. And so that feels bad. But when I sort of shift that to it's not, and recognizing again and again through my research, and I have to like remind myself, pointing to the work of being like, it's not about amount, it's how I engage during those times that I do actually, and I'm so grateful for, I do have a really wonderful relationship with both my kids and my partner while also doing this work that I really love. That takes a lot of my time. And so the that is something helpful, that it's not a sort of thing to do. Actually, I mean, I guess it's like how I show up in the time that I spend is the thing to do, and making those times, but it's also sort of coaching myself that it's like I'm doing it. Like I'm not a bad mom because I'm not able to be in the carpool line at pickup because of my work, but I do spend quality time in other ways. Another thing is exercise. that is Exercise is so important, and the research speaks to it. And I know it because when I don't exercise, I get into this funk. Yeah, it's the thing that I is the first to go when I feel busy. It's like I don't have time to go for a run. And because it's like taking care of the kids and work, and it just seems like this thing that feels like it's too much about me. But when I make the time, and I again have to touch to my research and read my own like writing to remind myself that yes, I need to make the time to go for a run, because not only does our work suggest that by increasing a sense of self efficacy, it actually lessens this sense of constraint from time and makes me feel like I have plenty of time, but also it makes me show up better. Like I enjoy the rest of my day more, and am a better mom when I am hanging out with my kids having gone for a run that morning. I am a better partner. I am better in the work that I do. So it's also recognizing that these investments of time into ourselves it's not selfish, nor is it frivolous. That we do need to prioritize some time to take care of and fill ourselves so that we feel happier and show up, because the research shows, and when you feel happier, it does make you nicer. Makes you more helpful for those around you. It does make you more motivated, and it does make you more adaptive in your problem solving. It does make you more creative. It does make you healthier so you can
Yeah.
like be alive longer to help those around you. So all to say that
Yeah.
reframing.
Well, there's a lot of things we could put in that category that people tend to skimp on, whether it's sleep because they don't think they have enough time, or I'll just wake up early because it doesn't matter so much, or nutrition in terms of how, it does take more time sometimes to eat nutritiously or choose foods that, often, unfortunately, the quick foods in our world tend to be ones that aren't as nutrient dense, and you start to see how everything interacts with everything. But no matter what, our mind will probably have something to say. And in ACT, we talk about cognitive diffusion of just knowing your mind's excuses and knowing your mind, your every single time your mind will say, "Oh, I don't have time for that." And that you don't have to necessarily let that be what drives your actions. You drive your actions based on what you know from a deeper knowing of yourself, and what will help you show up in your life with greater meaning and purpose, and also that third component of psychological richness, which is just about growth, of spending our time in ways in which we feel like we are growing and evolving as humans, right? So that's another aspect of that happiness triad, at least for me and my understanding of it. I love this book because it has all the research, and then it has a lot of personal anecdotes and stories about how you're using this, and your students as well. And then it just has the concrete stuff that people can try on, activities like the ones that we talked about today, and
Yeah.
even more activities that are great for folks that are maybe have a little bit of a New Year's, okay, 2023, what am I going to do differently? How do I want to spend my time this year? I do believe in like kind of mapping out your life a little bit rather than just having your life, sort of end up where it ends up, that you have some choice around how you engage in your life, how you set up your life so that it's in line with your values. And this book would be a great adjunct as you prepare for 2023.
Awesome. Well, I'm so glad that you are going to Mexico and going to enjoy as a result. And then I absolutely agree. I think everyone has a choice in how we invest our time, and from that, we have a choice in the happiness we experience and the joy we experience in our days.
Yes, and actually, to speak on the Mexico thing, something that you actually how I first learned about you was through an NPR story where you were talking about how to spend, your weekend as if you were on vacation, and if you
Yeah,
spend your weekend the research you did on that, if you spend your
yeah,
weekend as if you're on vacation, you'll be happier than if you just spend your usual weekend. And so, whether you're going to Mexico or not, there's ways in which you can bring the vacation to your life by how you're shifting the way that you relate to your weekend. You don't have to be in Mexico to connect with your partner or have a lazy, cup of coffee in the morning and enjoy time together in that way.
exactly. Yeah, and what the benefit of treating the weekend like a vacation, which we saw empirically has these wonderful effects. But you can actually apply it to sort of any time off. And the reason it's so effective is that it shifts us from that doing mode that we've talked about earlier, where we move through things to check things off of our lists, which tends to be our routine weekends, and it shifts us into being mode, where you can have that lazy morning and are just sort of in it and present, um, with yourself and as well as with those around you. So I'm glad that you brought that
Yeah. Well, that's what hooked me in the first place to wanting to read your
up.
book. So it's good we mentioned it at the end. All right, folks. Well, I'm going to give you all some tips from this conversation with Cassie Holmes to follow up on in terms of your week this week to try out. And then go check out Happier Hour. It's a great book for the new year. And I'll also put some links in the show notes for places you can find more about Cassie and her research and her many resources that are available to you. Thank you so much, Cassie, for being on the show. It's wonderful to talk with you.
Oh, thanks so much. This is a treat.